Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Caitlin Pieh. A quarter of the world's prison population is in the United States. 50% of inmates in American prisons are serving time for drug-related crimes. According to the American Psychological Association, the United States incarceration rate is 7 inmates per 1,000 people. The majority of the prison population is African American males, even though they are one of the smallest populations in the U.S. 1 in 3 African American males will spend time in jail, according to the Sentencing Project. The likelihood of Latino males being incarcerated is 1 in 6, and among white males, it's 1 in 17. One of the reasons incarceration rates are so high may be because in 27 states, the privatization of prison systems has been highly profitable. On Point's Nicholas Seaman has more.
Thank you, Caitlin. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us. First off, I have political science professor Jane Bays and political science professor Chaney. My first question is for both of you. As we've just heard, America leads the world in incarceration rates. More than half of our prisoners are there for drug offenses. Around the world, we are known as the gun country. Are we also a drug country? Professor Chaney, please.
I would say personally, when you think about a drug country, I think that as far as buyership and individuals using it here in the U.S., I think we would have to be one of the main countries throughout the world. And it affects us in so many different ways. You're thinking about relations with other countries. I think about in one of the classes I teach as far as U.S.-Mexican relations, and a number of times where I don't want to say stereotype, but one of the big issues are surrounding drug cartels. And you look at how they sustain themselves in the country, but then you have to wonder who's buying a number of the items that they are selling. And it's here in the United States. And this is one of the issues and problems that I think underlie so many different policies here in the U.S. But yes, your original point, yes, I do.
Professor Bays?
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, the United States and Europe both are large markets, and they have a lot of money. And so you don't want to go sell drugs in Bangladesh. You want to sell them in places where people have lots of money. And so they target those markets, and for that reason, we're one of the major ones because we're a major economy in the country, in the world. So yes.
And for you, Professor Bays, how is it that minorities are mostly affected by the drug war?
Oh, well, I think, you know, there are so many ways. I mean, one is marketing to particular constituencies, which you probably know more about than I, but also the fact that minorities, the whole criminalization of drugs really impacts minorities more than anybody else. I think with your figures, something like 98% of the folks who are in prison today are either minorities. I think it's 50% are blacks and 35% or 39% or something are Latinos. So those are the market. Those are the people who are being picked up for drugs and being targeted for drugs, either from the point of view of, certainly I'm not sure they're the major consumers of them, because many whites are not targeted in the same way by law enforcement as are those minority groups. So that's a major problem, and a further problem. Maybe I can go on later, but I'll let you go on, because another problem has to do with the prisons and how the prison industrial complex is really a major player in all this, which I can elaborate on later.
Statistics show that whites use as much as minorities. Why do you think it is that minorities are still getting picked up more than whites?
Well, I mean, there's a number of different issues underlying it. I mean, to a certain degree, you may look at somewhat racial profiling, stereotyping, depending as far as law enforcement agencies are concerned. I still think that is a problem within law enforcement. Another area of concern would be the type of drugs that are in question. And the reason why I bring that up is it goes back to even the issue that was looked upon as far as the Supreme Court, as far as penalty phases, depending on what an individual would be prosecuted on. Let's say the issue between crack and pure cocaine. There's always been issues as far as the penalty stages. You also have to look at district attorneys. You have to look at the prosecutorial element of it. Where is it that you may have a better chance of getting a case won in the DA's office. You have to look as far as representation in the legal community, as far as issues, lawyers at trial who can probably have a better attorney depending on the amount of income that they make. I mean, there's so many issues surrounding where you're looking, and I definitely agree with the professor here in regards when you're thinking about incarceration, who are most likely as far as to be incarcerated for certain crimes. I use this case in my class all the time. We are all familiar with the zip code of 90210. And if you have a helicopter in the area at 2 a.m. in the morning, and whether or not compared to that to, say, Figueroa and King, where you're talking about at the Coliseum and USC, in the same scenario, who would the DA's office probably take the case with? Would it be at 90210 compared to South LA, formerly South Central LA, and just the name of it itself changes. So, I mean, that's that discrepancy that you see that affects, unfortunately, a lot of minority groups.
Okay, and Professor Bays, some say that the war on drugs is racist. Do you agree? Is the reason for the war on drugs to prevent minorities from working hard minorities to move up?
Oh, I would be hard put to I mean, I don't think it's only racist. I mean, certainly a lot of the war on drugs has to do with white kids who get as well. The parents are upset about it as much as black parents are, but for the same reasons. The marketing of the drug, the stereotypes that develop with minority communities, the way in which it's done, the way to make money, and for many young people who come from poor backgrounds is to sell it, and of course that brings them right into the criminal part of the situation. Whereas the white kids get off, their parents buy them off. They have a good lawyer. They're just too bad. Johnny he made one mistake. Goodbye. Don't do it again, and. Whereas a black fellow of the same, or woman of the same crime or offense would be slammed in jail, and with none of that. So it has to do with the whole culture, and yes, that's a racist culture.
Anything to add, Professor Chaney?
No, I agree with that. And I mean, economics does play a point where you're looking as far as low income compared to high income families, the ability within our justice system. I mean, that is an element. But if you look at it proportionally and you look at it by the numbers as far as income levels, and unfortunately, statistically, you'll see certain groups have higher numbers within, let's say, maybe lower income levels compared to other groups. And even if education, you look at it, it's interesting, even with similar education, you will see that there's still a wage discrepancy amongst individuals, a lot of times based on either race, gender, as well. So definitely, I look at it in the same vein.
And has the war on drugs ever been worth it?
Okay, now that's an interesting question. If you're looking at as far as numbers, and I'll be honest with you, as far as incarceration, more individuals going to prison, I guess it could be argued that yes, it has worked. But has it worked in the essence as far as helping individuals? Has it helped, or let's say maybe change the dynamics of a social viewpoint and policy? I don't think it's worked. I think there's a number of issues underlying it, and one of the policies we were talking about would be as far as rehabilitating drug users and versus incarceration. I think despite the pure numbers, yes, it's worked. Unfortunately, I think that has to do a lot of times with funding. I think a lot of times with money, depending, especially if you have the privatized prisons that you see as well. So if I am running for office and I say, well, you know what, we were able to get these individuals off the streets, look at the numbers, hey, I mean, it looks great to a number of politicians. Then you also think about it, and I'm sorry if I'm going too far in it, but a lot of times when you think about the war on drugs, you're talking about the 1970s. You're talking about a culture in politics where there was this strong viewpoint as being anti-crime. Let's be more tough on a number of different issues. And I think that was a time frame where America was still coming out of the 1960s, being scared of what was going on. It was a change as far as a paradigm shift in the United States. So with this kind of silent majority, Richard Nixon, war on drugs, it was this paradigm that you see that, unfortunately, a lot of people bought into.
Going off that, Bill Clinton was recently interrupted last week by a Black Lives Matter activist. He didn't apologize for his anti-crime bill, which is what the activist was protesting in essence. He had an answer for it. We don't have the clip, but let me read you what he said. He said, "I don't know how you would characterize the gang leaders who got 13-year-old kids hopped up on crack and sent them out onto the street to murder other African-American children. Maybe you thought they were good citizens. You're defending the people who kill the lives you say matter." Professor Bays, does he have a point? Is he right?
Well, you know, he has been defending his. He said that we incarcerated too many people, and he said he made a mistake in signing that part of it. But he said also, I read a piece by one of his advisors at the time who had been writing that bill, and said in the bill there are a lot of other things. There were things like drug courts that were set up to try to remediate, to put to remediate and separate out the drug offenses from all the other offenses, particularly the ones of possession, and essentially setting up a separate court with separate judges, with separate remedial aspects. So doing some of the remedial work and some of the recidivism work that would be necessary, or counseling, that were set up, and that bill did do that. So there were a lot of things in the bill, I think, that were probably more progressive than the put them all in jail thing, which was also part of it. So I think Bill Clinton has apologized for the fact that too many people were incarcerated, but I think it also has to do with, and I'm not sure how this happens, but if you look at the figures, the number of people who've been put away keeps going up, and the number of crimes is static. So what is the reason for that? I mean, why is it that the judges and the juries have been, or maybe somebody has rewritten the law in such a way that those penalties are greater, or you take essentially a misdemeanor becomes a felony? And so some people are arguing, and then there's no relationship with the number of crimes. There is at the beginning, but then it keeps going up, and the crime rate is the same. So there's been a definite increase in the number of people who are incarcerated and the number of people who are charged for when they're actually acquitted. I mean, actually committed. They're criminalized. Essentially, they're guilty, declared guilty, by virtue of being brought to court. It goes up, and with no particular reason, and except maybe the enthusiasm of people in getting involved with putting people away.
Possibly.
And I don't know what the answer to it is, but it's very clearly not a direct relationship to the number of crimes that are committed. So we really filled and I think Bill Clinton is right. He's right to apologize for that. And he's also right to defend the fact that there were some good things in the bill, which other people are now trying to emphasize, like the drug courts and some of the things that you were talking about. But there's no money for it. That's the problem. There's not enough money for it, and there's not a lot of incentive to provide money for it, and unless there was some way to make money.
It's unfortunate.
And if I may, do you want to say something?
Oh no, go for it. Yeah.
To me, one of the biggest problems is that we've made the prisons into a money-making operation, and that provides all kinds of incentives to keep people, to fill the prisons and to keep them filled. And so you have essentially two things that are going on. One is the privatization of the prisons, which began, I think, in 84, began from the first one was started. And they have subsequently been expanding. I think there are 18 corporations now that are involved in something like 27 states. They're privatized, and they are there to make money. And they make contracts with states to fill their prisons.
But isn't there money in rehabilitation centers, something that pharmaceutical companies can get their hands on and kind of help them out in order to decriminalize drugs? Most of these people that are going to jail are doing it because they're using or they have it on them. Isn't there an alternative to just locking people up?
Well, that's the question. If you've got a money-making thing behind it, and you have corporations like Corrections Corporation of America or Wackenhut or Cornell Corrections Corporation, all big, that controls something like 75% of these private prisons, making deals and contributing money to campaign contributions. And Citizens United didn't do anything to help that.
It's so true.
Citizens United, which was a case that says that a corporation is a private individual, that means a corrections corporation is a private individual, is subject to all the privileges of a citizen under the Constitution. It's outrageous. And they can give money to any campaign without anybody knowing they're giving. It's all private. You don't have to say you're giving money to a congressman, to a law enforcement person. Who knows to whom they give money?
Who's benefiting the most from this?
I tell you, I have to agree with the professor. A lot of times when you're looking at this, you are looking at the corporations, you're looking at those businesses that are involved with the privatization of prisons. I think to a certain degree, you look at the pharmaceutical companies. There could be more as far as their relationship on providing medication for the betterment of individuals who may be addictive. But you also got to look at it. They look at the profit margin as well. If they come up with, let's say, a prescribed drug that can help an individual kick the habit, well, then they're in a sense also looking at themselves, because they're going to end up losing money if that helps too many people. And I don't want to be, a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, just looking at the numbers. They're there to make a profit. And unfortunately, when you're looking at the bottom line with money, you're talking about cases such as Citizens United versus the FEC. You're talking about these corporations who are able to spend millions of dollars on those politicians in which they feel that will help them in their own best interest. You're talking about where money should be diverted into, let's say, rehabilitation programs, or let's say possibly drug courts. But then if that's the case where the money's going, it has to be used in a sensible way. And this is what I mean. If it looked upon using that, maybe have something like, as professors, sometimes we have a pretest to see what a student may know going into a semester. And the reason why I bring that up, have maybe those psychologists, or let's say experts in the field, individuals who have issues as far as drug addiction, see as far as more of a psychological effect, what are their backgrounds, determine as far as maybe what type of help they need, and then go on as far as maybe to a drug court, and then have some ability as far as a process where they can slowly be going back into the social and economic society. Because you have a number of times those who are booked, or let's say convicted on a felony, they can't vote, stuck in prison. Once they get the rap sheet, that's usually it for them as far as their future is concerned. You're talking about a lot of times with these programs coming about, if it's not making money, unfortunately a lot of businesses don't want to deal with it. Here in California, we're really in a precarious situation, because I'll go back to when Prop 13 was passed, and you're talking about a lot of the funding that then left the state as far as revenue, tuition, schools, but a lot of social programs that definitely are needed. If the money is not there, states and cities, they're not going to support it. I mean, it's a very large web that goes into it when you think about it.
Is part of that web the gun violence as well? Given that there is a violence towards this drug market, are the filtering of these guns to these streets for people to hold, gangs to hold guns, is that also a factor playing into this whole prison system so that gun lobbyists can make their money too?
I would say that is a definite factor to look into. Definitely. I mean, you look at a number of times, especially under certain, let's say, drug trade, guns are going to be a part of it. If there's gang activity, guns are going to be a part of it. How are those guns licensed? Who are they sold to? Why are there certain groups who have access to military-grade weapons? I mean, what are we doing out here? But then also I have to think about it. It's interesting because when looking at this subject area, we think about the hard drugs, but then you also look at the issue of alcoholism. That's a drug as far in itself. And then this comes into play where you see somewhat of a double standard for those as far as, alcohol, the licensing, the use of it, how it is a part of our system. But, drugs on the other hand, it's stigmatized. You watch on television, you go, was a Mad Men. It was the culture of the 60s. Everybody, have a shot of this or that after work. We're used to that in this country. But when you're talking about drugs, that's a different element, different animal. That goes to the elements. You think about marijuana use. I mean, there's so many different. Yeah.
Let me ask Professor Pieh this. While heroin use has climbed among all demographic groups, it has skyrocketed among whites. Nearly 90% of those who tried for the first time in the past decade were white. Are we now trying to politically reverse the end product of the war on drugs, or do we now only care about it that's affecting white suburban communities?
I don't know a lot about this, but I do know that there was a lot of publicity about it in New Hampshire and Vermont with with the presidential campaign up in that area, and the fact that so many of and that's primarily a white constituency, and their youth there are dying like flies from heroin. I don't understand that. I don't know who's pumping drugs into that particular, who's marketing them to that particular constituency, and I'm not an expert on that at all. But it certainly is. And I don't know to what I haven't seen a whole lot about it in L.A. More about meth, basically.
Right. Exactly.
And meth being much more in L.A., I think, than.
I would agree with that. Definitely.
He should know a lot more about this than I do.
Well, I would just say, just from
he's a former FBI officer, so he knows a lot more about this than I do.
Meth is a big item here. Heroin, to be honest with you, it kind of reminds me of decades ago when you think about heroin, angel dust, a number of those different types of drugs that was really in vogue in the 1970s. But I'd have to look into that more as far as the racial.
That's okay.
correlation.
Well, let me ask you this. What is the case for legalizing drugs in general?
Depends what type of drugs you're talking about legalizing.
All drugs.
Oh, I would personally have issues as far as all drugs being legalized. Now, as far as marijuana, I have come to a point where I would think that there's a case to be said as far as marijuana being legalized, and the question comes up, would that be a bridge to other drugs? Well, if you want to take that out of it, there's always a bridge to something. So I would say that in that case of marijuana, it should not be classified as far as the same level as maybe cocaine or harsher drugs. I think we have to look at those drugs in a different way than maybe marijuana per se. But I think to a certain degree, there should be at least decriminalization, legalization on certain types of drugs.
And there are systems in place. We have one in Utah and in different places around the world in Europe where they have houses set up for people who are addicted to drugs. And they set them up to let them use it in a room. After that, they have medical centers and counselors within this house as well, also helping them in case they decide to get that help. Isn't that an institution you think that would benefit, Professor Pieh?
I'm sure it would, but who pays for it? And we don't have that kind of society here. That's mainly in Northern Europe, that kind of thing, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And they do a lot of things better for social welfare purposes than we do. They don't, I don't think they have they don't put people in prison, they don't have death penalties. There are all kinds of things they do that are not punitive with regard to their populations when they are wrongdoing. And, on marijuana, it seems to me that what I worry about is for children having marijuana. And so to me, I think I don't see that marijuana is particularly more dangerous than alcohol. But alcohol is horrible as well, and alcohol is not legal for youngsters to drink, and I don't think marijuana should be either. But if it's readily available, it's going to be more of it being used by young people. And that's frightening because I think it does screw you up as a youngster, to have that with all the things that are going on in adolescence. To have that on top of it is not great, and I'm not in favor of it. But I think the idea of legalizing marijuana and particularly decriminalizing it is particularly important.
And what do you think about these other institutions that are in places like Europe? Do you think, why isn't America ready for that?
Well, one, I totally agree with the professor. You're looking at profitability. That's one. But I also think that here in the U.S., we have a Puritan society. I think socially, in the U.S., you have a religious element. Now, we have this Puritan society in the U.S., and there's a lot of things that may fly in certain other countries that are just not going to happen here in the United States. And you have areas in the United States, such as the Bible Belt region of the United States, even within our own country. There are certain social aspects that are looked upon, or let's say, I don't want to say allowed, but we see more of, say, in the West Coast, maybe back east, than we do in a lot of Bible Belt states. And so with that, if we even tried, a country as a whole, to try and, let's say, start up similar programs that you have in European nations, I think you're going to get a big backlash from a lot of politics going to be played. A lot of people are going to be against it. You have a number of interest groups who will be against it as well. So I think this is where here in the U.S. is going to be that difference that you see in Europe.
There's a lack of maturity then in American society as well.
We're much more diverse. We're much more big. We're much larger. We speak hundreds of different languages and cultures and religions, which is not the case in Europe, although it may be coming so, given the migration patterns. And they're going to be having the similar problems, of different but similar kinds of problems, because they are becoming much more diverse.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining me.
Everywhere that we go, he makes people laugh and makes people smile, and I feel like I have that quality.
He's the one who always takes me fishing. I watch golf with him. And
I watch him cook, because when I grow up, I want to be a cook too.
we have the same faces like this.
Dad is the one, when you fall, that picks you up.
That unconditional sense of presence and reassurance is really what makes him my father.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
It's a short ride from your neighborhood to your naturehood. To find a neighborhood park or green space near you, visit discovertheforest.org.
A single ember that escapes from a wildfire can travel more than a mile. You can't control where that ember will land, only what happens when it does. Get Fire Adapted now at fireadapted.org.
Thank you for tuning in to On Point. You can catch us on CSUNTVnews.com, KCSN, The Sundial, and LA 36 on Sunday at 11:30. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Caitlin Pieh. Thanks for watching.